Badlands, running to Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be joining you once again for another episode of Breaking History. We have a lot to go through today. I just got a call about an hour ago from Gordon, who got a little bit held up on the job site. So he'll be joining us about 30 or 35 minutes in the future. Until then, I took the liberty of preparing a few slides. We are entering into we've been in some pretty tumultuous periods in world history, facing both the threat of thermonuclear war, of various aspects of a crisis the likes of which I don't think humanity has ever experienced. There's never been 8 billion of us on the planet. We have a systemic breakdown that's been built into the system. The entire transatlantic banking system has been wired to blow as a time bomb of sorts over the course of several decades at the very least. And a very, very vicious, stubborn deep state, which is incapable, I would say, of eating humble pie and would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven, as some would say. Now, there are obviously major schisms, major rifts, fissures, featuring some very important battle lines in the U.S. The Patriot movement is a confused creature, but one that has a lot of authenticity. And if there is going to be any salvation for the West, I think from my vantage point here in Canada, it's going to be through the activation of the best of Western traditions through the fight being waged right now by forces that have converged and are organizing around the Patriot movement, which is why I do this show, and I love doing this show with Gordon and with all of you guys. So I've got a few slides like I promised. We're going to have a bit of a JFK orientation as well, since we are approaching the anniversary of JFK's murder on November 22nd, 1963. And there's certain very stark parallels, very important lessons to be gleaned from that battle. So we're going to go through some of those. But before we do, we're going to have a word from today's sponsor, one of today's two sponsors, My Pillow. Here we go.
I'm excited to announce our Christmas extravaganza is finally here. Get this season's flannel sheets for as low as $59.98. They won't last long, so get them while you can. Our famous My Slippers, they haven't been on sale for over a year. Regularly $119.98, now only $59.98. Our 6-piece towel sets are back in stock with extremely limited quantities, only $29.98. With hundreds of MyPillow products, there's something for everyone on your Christmas list. Bathrobes, duvets, quilts, down comforters, and so much more. So go to MyPillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to save on all MyPillow products. For example, flannel sheets for as low as $59.98, or our 6-piece towel sets, just $29.98. But that's not all. I'm extending our 60-day money-back guarantee until March 1st of 2025. Plus, all orders over $75 or more ship absolutely free.
Okay, so here we go. Now, I think that most people are probably aware that there's been a decision made somewhere in Washington, somewhere. I'm not even going to say it was Biden, because I don't think Biden can authorize his own breakfast. However, there are forces that are hard at work sabotaging the incoming, or who would like to sabotage the incoming administration of President Trump. Probably, according to Douglas McGregor and others who have a pretty good feel for the beast. Likely coming from the circles around Jake Sullivan, Rhodes Scholar, probably Blinken, and the broader monstrosity that they represent, that has authorized the use of long-range missiles supplied by the United States to Kiev to strike Russia up to 300, I believe, miles into Russian territory, which Vladimir Putin and other leading Russian officials have made the point that this is a very serious game changer, because it would basically be an admission. I mean, not that we haven't had foreign troops already engaged, mercenary forces and other, covert NATO operatives, CIA operatives on the ground in Kiev since the earliest days of this conflict. But this would make it very explicit, primarily, as Putin made the point, Ukraine doesn't have the ability to do this by themselves, to coordinate, to utilize these long-range missile delivery systems. They don't have the satellite capability to manage them, to carry out the strikes, the targeting, All of this would be managed entirely by U.S. military industrial forces tied directly to NATO. And so there's been a new nuclear deterrence doctrine that Russia has unveiled that even authorizes Russia to utilize its nuclear arsenal, even in the context of a non-nuclear strike, such as these long-range missiles might deliver, as a strong message to the West to reverse this course fast. It's important, hopefully a very an incentive which is taken to heart, but we don't know yet. We know that Kiev did apparently launch an attack onto the Bryansk region of Russia. I believe that was this morning or last night. We haven't seen exactly what the retaliation is going to be. There will be some response. Obviously, there's a certain strategic ambiguity that's also being maintained. So that there's I think there's a certain testing of Russia to see what they're going to do, how far we can push the goalposts, how far we can press onto Russia before they actually do break. So there's a little bit of psyop going on that level, but this is a really dangerous game of chicken, I got to say. So anyway, JFK's murder, as I mentioned, was November 22nd, 1963. And we're coming up to the anniversary. The fact that this current sabotage operation of the incoming President Trump administration, who basically made a very, I believe he's very serious about his efforts, his intention to undo the war drive against Russia is a very serious intention. So there are more than a few parallels to what was done to sabotage the incoming administration of President Kennedy in the early weeks and months of his new administration. So I'm going to go through some of that within the context of the broader strategic battle that John F. Kennedy situated himself within, to give people a sense that it's really the exact same dynamic, although obviously with technologies that are a little bit more advanced 80 or 65 years later, but it's the same principles on so many levels. And it's very important to take this in. So first things first, a little introduction. The slides I'm going to be showing derive from research that is contained within volume 1, 2, and actually 3 and 4 of The Clash of the Two Americas. So if people want to really do some further deep diving and digging, also there's my wife's work, The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set, that goes through a lot of material I've found very useful, as has Anton Chaikin's work on treason in America and who we are. So people can email me if they want to know about how to acquire some of these resources. JFK versus the Empire. This is something that a lot of people don't realize. They don't understand the nature of the full spectrum battle he was a part of, or the identity that he placed himself into at an early age. And one of the key things is that as a Democrat, it was a very different Democratic Party that JFK led, which was largely tempered and shaped by the battles that had been waged by the figure of Henry Wallace, the vice president there on the right, and Franklin Roosevelt, who both together had done a very effective and largely, I mean, this has been lost from our history books. It's been washed out. Even from those who like FDR, they have no idea what this is, what the battle was really about, because FDR stopped 3 attempts at a new world order during the course of his 4 terms. He died in his 4th term as the president. He sabotaged the League of Nations One World Government agenda in 1933, did it again in the later 30s. He did it again by working very hard with his Russian counterparts and with the Chinese to sabotage the fascist world empire agenda that was being bankrolled by his own enemies that had sponsored the Smedley-Butler coup, the failed coup that Smedley-Butler blew the whistle on in 1934, the earlier assassination attempt utilizing an anarchist Freemason, Giuseppe Zangara, who missed and killed the mayor of Chicago standing next to FDR in 1933. But this was the Wall Street, London axis of bankers that are above nations that always wanted fascism as the economic miracle solution. And even though FDR died, his ally, Henry Wallace, hung on as an influence with a big network of patriots, shaping again the terrain in which JFK was to be organized, was to operate as an inspired figure. So just a word from Henry Wallace, just to get a sense of what was being intended and what was being sabotaged. And he was warning in 1944 that fascism in the post-war inevitably will push steadily for Anglo-Saxon imperialism and eventually for war with Russia. Already American fascists are talking and writing about this conflict and using it as an excuse for their internal hatreds and intolerances towards certain races, creeds, and classes. This is 1944. Of course, the dual growth of the Jim Crow laws, the KKK revival, the lynchings of Black Americans that had returned home as war heroes from World War II. There were hundreds who had been lynched and murdered by this FBI, CIA-sponsored revivalism of the old KKK of Albert Pike that was coincident with the external turn towards empire that these pro-fascist figures within the U.S. deep state wished to bring about. So that's the same, two sides of the same thing. He says in Soviet Mission Asia, the piece that got him fired under Truman, when he was a Commerce Secretary, he was downgraded. This is after FDR was dead. He writes here, before the blood of our boys is scarcely dry on the field of battle, these enemies of peace try to lay the foundation for World War III. These people must not succeed in their foul enterprise. We must offset their poison by following the policies of Roosevelt and cultivating the friendship of Russia in peace as well as in war. And the idea, again, was back then, the big fight was ending the system of empire as the basis of foreign policy and instead encourage the idea of a strong nation helping the poor nations that have been victimized by assisting them in infrastructure and industrial advanced development. That was the internationalization of the New Deal. In Africa and South America and beyond, in India, there was the big fight around building dams and using the American military as something that could be rebranded as an engineering force to build bridges instead of just blowing them up. So that whole battle over what the post-war paradigm was going to be, we see what side Wallace leaned towards. Of course, Wallace was purged, and instead you had the Cold War introduced. You had JIC 502 promoted and passed into effectively law, into action as a U.S. military security doctrine titled Implications of Soviet Possessions of Atomic Weapons. And it was January 20th, 1950, claimed that once the Soviets had 200 atomic bombs, they could launch surprise attacks to defeat the United States, with no validation that this was actually true. But they projected, like a Freudian projection, the idea that Russia wanted to militarily destroy all non-communist countries. And so it was JIC 502, which would be the first to put forward a justification for the preventative first strike concept, supported by a massive military buildup under the pretense of a preemptive war. So this idea of preemptively destroying your neighbor before they could destroy you, utilizing nuclear warheads or anything, that found its origin in a strategic doctrine in the Rand Corps circles that put this thing into practice in 52. This also coincides with the the NSC 68 program that effectively targeted Russia as, or basically called for the military encirclement of Russia and the defense of the British Empire as is something which had to be defended, as the interests of the British Empire had to be defended in order to stop communism. So this was a real perversion of capitalism, a perversion of the American system. But dumb, stupid people inside of the United States leadership and deep state went along with that to devastating effect. So this is what JFK is. A young man. He's a congressman, 1946. He's still a congressman. He's touring the world. He's bringing his brother along to the Middle East, to India, to Africa, and really getting a sense of the nature of the international battle. He's meeting very interesting people, and he comes back from one of his tours and he gives a radio address to the American people. And he describes it just to get a sense of this man's character. He's still a congressman, a young man in his early 30s. He says here, the post-war colonial world is an area which poverty and sickness and disease are rampant. Injustice and inequality are old and ingrained. The fires of nationalism are now ablaze. For 100 years and more, it has been the source of empire for Western Europe, for England and France and Holland. A Middle East command operating without the cooperation and support of the Middle East countries would intensify every anti-Western force now active in the area, and from a military standpoint would be doomed to failure. The very sands of the desert would rise up to oppose the imposition of the outside control on the destinies of these proud peoples. The true enemy of the Arab world is poverty and want. Our intervention, and that's good. He's getting across here that the real enemy is poverty and want. How do you deal with that? Well, you got to provide the means by which people can supply their own needs, industrially, food, greening the deserts as FDR outlined for Africa and the Middle East. Those types of things work in the long run to help people learn how to fish, not just give them a few fish under U.S. aid. But then he says, our intervention on behalf of England's oil investments in Iran, directed more at the preservation of our interests outside of Iran than Iran's own development, our failure to deal effectively after 3 years with the terrible human tragedy of the more than 700,000 Arab refugees, Palestinians. These are things that have failed to sit well with the Arab desires and make empty the promises of the voice of America. So at this point, he's very clear that America is becoming the dumb giant brutalizer on behalf of the British imperial overlord class in subduing nations that are aspiring to national development. Say a word, he's already referencing in this, not just the Nakba, the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians in a massive land grab, which is he's saying this is a huge injustice. But also he's referring directly to President Mohamed Mossadegh, who only 2 years after this speech would find himself overthrown in a CIA-managed coup d'etat, also assisted by MI6, when he carried out the heresy of a nationalist saying that, no, we have a legal authorization to utilize Iranian oil under Iranian soil for the benefit of Iranian development. And formerly that had been dominated by the Seven Sisters, especially BP, British Petroleum, Shell Dutch Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, and a consortium of British enterprises that had almost full control over the Iranian natural gases and oil. So this is what he dared to nationalize. He did a pretty good job, even fought at The Hague legally as a lawyer and succeeded in gaining international support on his behalf. He had the support also of the Tehran Agreement that Roosevelt had forced Churchill to sign in 1943 that guaranteed colonial peoples the right to their sovereignty and territorial integrity and right to utilize their own resources. So that was an important legal battle that Churchill did not want to agree to, but he had no choice at the time. So very important concept. Again, Mossadegh was overthrown, complete color revolution, and a puppet regime under Zahedi was placed into power that kept control for a very long time thereafter. This is what JFK was watching disrupt world peace and progress. Jacobo Arbenz, the president of Guatemala, also fought to nationalize United Fruit and the vast Meyer Lansky mafia interests that had gained control of Guatemala, and he dared nationalize it and pushed, again, just like Mossadegh, a program of massive economic development, dams, hydroelectric dams to benefit the people, to create abundant electricity, to lift them out of poverty. That's what he was doing, and that's why he had to be overthrown, which was done under a CIA coup overseen by Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State of the U.S. under Eisenhower, and the CIA director, Allen. 1955, Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh kicks out France, France being a colonial power, kicks them out. And what does John Foster Dulles do? He immediately pushes to utilize America's nuclear arsenal to nuke Vietnam for their defiance of our French imperial allies. Now, the irony here is we've all been trained to believe that Ho Chi Minh is this evil creature, this evil James Bond-like villain. Look at his mustache. Look at his beard. He must be evil. Well, actually, he was a poet statesman of a highly noble character. I read some of the translations of his poetry, and it's so sublime. But he was also a very courageous fighter, and he actually was inspired by FDR's promise for the world to become liberated of empire, and even modeled the Vietnamese Constitution of 1946 directly, almost verbatim, on the U.S. Declaration of Independence. As a small extract here I selected, begins with all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America of 1776. Vietnamese Ho Chi Minh, right? Actually, he was betrayed, backstabbed, and instead of being given independence for the suffering that he and his people went through in fighting World War II and the Japanese fascists, instead, the Japanese fascists were commanded to be released as POWs, rearmed by the Anglo-French and British operators, and then basically reconquer the Vietnamese at the same time as the French were empowered to go back in and reconquer the people that they had formerly dominated for over a century and had fought in guerrilla warfare. So you see that even though communism was indeed spreading, he was utilizing a communist system during the Cold War. This fight against empire precedes communism by a very long margin. Before Karl Marx was even born, the fight of the Vietnamese people, the Koreans, was already a major fight against empire, and it's not about communism versus capitalism. Is why I'm saying this. There's something much more long-term and deeper seated in the battle that has been washed out of the clean, simplified narratives that we're supposed to abide by. Another man who was supposed to meet JFK early on in JFK's early administration was Patrice Lumumba, who 3 days before JFK was inaugurated as president in January of 1961, was murdered by the CIA, and yeah, that was a terrible story. Again, for being defiant enough to demand that Congo control their own resources and push to nationalize gold and other minerals. While JFK was preparing and growing his understanding of the world situation, there's a very important thing, which is important. I'm doing this slide because of today. There is a rehabilitation of the Bandung Conference principles, what are known as the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, outlined first in 1954 at the Sino-Indian Agreement, and then re-emphasized at the Bandung Conference of 58 in Indonesia, calling for mutual respect, that the basis of international law must be the mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, basically the Nuremberg principles in play, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit for all, and peaceful coexistence. Very big emphasis on the philosophy of win-win cooperation. So that is not a utopian pipe dream. That is very realistic and a principle of economic and foreign policy based upon natural law. The same concepts philosophically that the founding fathers of America were very, very understanding of and inspired by, as was JFK. JFK put it in his own words right before this is, I believe this is after he's won, or maybe right before he's won the popular vote against Nixon. He says here, call it nationalism, to a speech in Stanford. Call it nationalism, call it anti-colonialism. Africa is going through a revolution. Africans want a higher standard of living. 75% of the population now lives by subsistence agriculture. They want an opportunity to manage and benefit directly from the resources in, on, and under their land. The African peoples believe that the science, technology, and education available in the modern world can overcome their struggle for existence, that their poverty, squalor, ignorance, and disease can be conquered. The balance of power is shifting into the hands of the 2/3 of the world's people who want to share what the 1/3 has already taken for granted. So again, powerful is coming from somebody who is going to become the president of the United States with that level of appreciation of the injustice, the nature of the empire, the nature of its evil, with an intention to do something about it is really strong. Now, as I mentioned, today's operation to sabotage the incoming Trump administration has its precedents. I see it very clearly in the efforts by people like the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lyman Lemnitzer, Allen Dulles, and really the entirety of the Joint Chiefs back in 1961 or 60 even, to prepare for a military conflict with Russia before the new president could consolidate his power. Now, in March 1960, JFK is often given the blame for being the catalyzer of the Bay of Pigs. It's not true. It's a lie. This was the ball was begun before JFK was even elected. On March 1960, Eisenhower approved already a small Cuban exile support program, and within a couple of months, that program was upgraded to 3,000-man invasion force. So that by the time this was all sanctioned, this whole operation to use these Cuban exiles to invade Castro, who only had three military planes in the entire fleet, but a very, very close connection with Russia. Also, like Arbenz, Castro had nationalized United Fruit operations, had kicked out the casinos, had kicked out the Meyer Lansky Italian Jewish mafia crime syndicates. So, he'd already begun surviving several assassination attempts. Unlike Arbenz of Guatemala, Castro was better at staying alive and didn't get kicked out, didn't get couped, was able to hold on to power. And so he earned the ire and hate of the entire deep state of Allen Dulles that was preparing to kill JFK. So what did they do? Well, there's a special relationship that Cuba had with Russia, and this invasion was launched on April 17th to 20th. Kennedy could not really do much to stop the invasion itself, but what he did want was to take out the ability for Cuba to respond with any type of air support that would thus justify a broader U.S. enmeshment to provide air coverage and naval coverage to the Cuban invaders, which were just a proxy force, kind of like, ISIS today. Now, JFK wanted those planes that Castro had taken out, all three of them, from a Nicaraguan Cuban exile grouping that was supported militarily by the U.S. in order to get rid of the excuse to say, okay, well, look, Cuba is using heavy arsenals, heavy military equipment, so we should come in and back the little guy, kind of like what's being done in Ukraine today. That was canceled by McGeorge Bundy. He basically canceled the B-52 airstrikes, leaving the invasion force of 3,000 men pretty wide open. And the idea was to provoke a slaughter in order to justify a military invasion, which is what Dulles and Lyman Lemnitzer were pushing the whole time. That didn't happen. JFK did not provide the air or naval support, and the thing fizzled out. Now, it was an embarrassment. He had to own it, much like Trump has had to own, in my assessment, many of the worst decisions by this independent deep state operation that has run all sorts of destructive operations outside of his influence in his first presidency, and will likely do more of that, because a president can't just go and say, hey, look, I've got this independent CIA cartel doing things outside of my program. That's a sign of weakness that would immediately lose the respect that you would need on the international stage to carry out anything. And so he owned it, but he then began a process of counterattack onto Dulles, onto the other operators of the deep state, working to try to get the U.S. into a war with Russia. I'm going to say something more about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which plays into this. He had the help, though. He had the help of people like Eleanor Roosevelt, who had major problems, but at the very least, she didn't want World War III. She was able to, I think, give JFK certain advice about what had happened to sabotage her late husband, and he used that information pretty usefully. He had General, I'm all of a sudden blanking. He had General de Gaulle as well, providing him early assistance into the nature of this thing. De Gaulle was fighting his own deep state complex, and Douglas MacArthur. General MacArthur was also somebody who had a very strong sense of the nature of the beast and was helping to organize JFK as an advisor to help him navigate this den of snakes. Again, I mentioned Lyman Lemnitzer, the head of the Joint Chiefs, somebody who was tutored by leading British aristocrats during World War II in the Pacific Fleet that he was incubated under. He was a complete whore for the British Empire and for any systems of hereditary power. And he served his role as a puppet very well, pushing for some of the worst ideas. That's Dulles. They're smoking his stupid pipe. Some of Lemnitzer's terrible ideas involved his July 20th, 1961 preemptive attack on the Soviet Union that JFK turned down, and his 1962 Operation Northwoods, which was recently declassified. I think most people probably have heard about this, which basically called for attacking a U.S. passenger airplane as a false flag to justify a war, an invasion on Cuba, and a broader war on Russia, which JFK again turned down. So these creatures led directly into the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, JFK did do something smart in that he and his brother organized a Cuban study group to investigate how the Bay of Pigs was mismanaged, and he was able to use the findings of the study group to justify the firing of Allen Dulles at the end of 1961, and then also, of course, Charles Cabell, the second in command, the deputy director of the CIA, as well as Richard Bissell, the head of operations, the OPC, the Operations of Policy Coordination, the psychological warfare branch of the CIA. That same Richard Bissell was also fired at the early days of 1962, as JFK had a whole plan to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the wind. And he actually was passing legislation to do just that. And I'm going to say what that is after I say something about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So 1962, October 16th to 28th, what you have here is the findings that there are indeed missiles that could deliver a nuclear warhead being set up inside of Cuba. Again, I would not say that this was an offensive, but rather a defensive strategy, something that was designed to dissuade the U.S. from doing something which Rand Corps and other psychopaths like Dulles and Lemnitzer were pushing for, the preemptive nuclear strikes against Russia being what I'm talking about. And there you see the strike capability of these warheads in Cuba that resulted in 12 days of heated tension. Luckily, there were back channels between Khrushchev and JFK and his brother. They did a lot of all-nighters, a lot of 8 balls to stay awake and stay courageous. But you really had the whole Joint Chiefs that they were up against saying that, no, we should not just do a blockade, we should really do an all-out attack on Russia. Now, what was Russia doing this for? As it was understood as part of the backdoor negotiations, Russia had done this because the U.S. and Britain, their great ally, had already set up a Jupiter, a U.S.-managed, UK-managed nuclear strike capability of long-range missiles in Turkey and in the U.K., the Thor and Jupiter missiles, as well as in Italy. And especially in Turkey, this was the most strategically dangerous for Russia's thinkers, Russia's strategists. And as part of the back channel negotiations, those are the strike ranges that we see on the screen right there of the 3 missile systems. It's a lot worse today under NATO, I got to say. But what was negotiated is that JFK agreed to remove quietly the U.S.-led Jupiter nuclear warheads if Russia would agree to remove the Cuban missiles, and that was arranged very, very competently, quietly, elegantly, but it was done and the world was preserved. So a very important lesson in how to do proper diplomacy out of an idea of mutual respect. Now, additionally, what JFK put forth, at the same time as he was the incoming president, he didn't just do one thing or another. People say like, oh, why did he die? Was it his fight against the oil barons, or was it something else? Was it his battle with the mafia? Was the Cubans who killed him? Was it there's so many different theories. And what was he doing? Was it because he was disrupting things in Africa by helping Africa develop through things like the Volta River Dam to help industrialize Africa, starting with Ghana? Well, it was kind of like all of those things. Was it his battle with the Wall Street bankers, with the JP Morgan Steel complex? Well, yeah, it was a bit of all of those things, but it was also not any of those things in particular. It's not a mechanical thing. He was thinking in a natural way, full spectrum manner, culturally, economically, geopolitically, you name it. He was operating on a very human level playing field. Now, before I say anything about this, what he was doing, we're going to listen to a word from today's sponsor, and then we're going to usher in Gordon as he participates here in the last 3 or 4 slides of the show, and then we just chat a little bit. So before we bring in Gordon and finish this formal presentation, let's hear a word from River BTC, River Bitcoin. Here we are. Are you ready to diversify your assets with Bitcoin? Introducing River, the official Bitcoin partner at Badlands Media, where you can navigate the world of Bitcoin with confidence. With River, you can buy Bitcoin like a pro. With the assurance of being licensed and regulated right here in the United States, River ensures your Bitcoin journey is smooth and secure with on-demand live support at your fingertips. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase required. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $10. Visit badlandsmedia.tv/river to create your Bitcoin account, River account today. That's badlandsmedia.tv/river. River, shaping the future of finance, one Bitcoin at a time. So that's River Bitcoin. So with that, without further ado, let's introduce Gordon.
Hey, Gordon. What's up?
What's up? How you doing,
man? Good, good. Sorry for being tardy to the party. Yeah, just was on a job site, but man, I did catch some of the presentation. Verizon has been a disaster in my area for the past, 10 days. I don't know if it has anything to do with what's going on politically in the world, but it seems to be everything. My laptop, my phone, my wife has said it. My people I work with have said it. So I was only able to catch like some of the stuff in the car listening. First of all, hello everybody. How you doing, Matt?
I'm good. I'm very good. Yeah.
Good. I do want to catch the end of the presentation, but the preventative warfare thing, I'm going to hold my thoughts until the end. Let's finish the presentation. And but Gart was amazing. huge representation of breaking history fans at GART again after Deadwood. It was the same thing with Deadwood. So it was awesome having like an over-representation of breaking history fans there. So
all right.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Loving yeah, I love it. That's great. And by the way, Cynthia and I did a little bit of a cross-Canada tour, speaking in Calgary and Toronto, and the level of recognition and support that I encountered for people who like religiously watch breaking history was amazing. Like, it was fantastic. Canadians are loving it. So yeah, that was good for the soul. All right, so let me just wrap up my my little punchlines here. I've just been sort of like laying a bunch of crumbs out, so we're gonna like go into the. I don't want to use the gingerbread cottage thing because that has witchcraft and cannibalism connotations. But anyway, I've been laying a a certain composition. So here we go. Now, what JFK was actually doing to combat this disgusting mutant monstrosity foreign thing inside of the U.S. is worth looking at quickly. So number one, I already mentioned it, his battle for the International New Deal. He gave speeches on this based on the concept of doing what Henry Wallace and FDR were incapable of doing because it was sabotaged, which was providing U.S. Economic support for the full spectrum development of industrial of formerly colonized countries. I mentioned the Volta River Dam that even today has a plaque in honor of JFK's memory in Ghana. Even today, that's there. That was the biggest hydroelectric dam in African history until today's Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam. But that was huge, and it was supposed to be the springboard for a broader African industrial renaissance. Of course, that didn't happen because Kwame Nkrumah was ousted in a CIA coup in 1966, which prevented a lot of that momentum. But the point being is that was the idea, as well as South American countries, Latin American, Indian countries were in negotiations with JFK to provide, to get access to real development, not just U.S. aid, not just money for conditionalities, but real aid that would help them help themselves. So number one, you got that. You got the breaking out of closed systems. That all kind of falls into place. His space program was a big part of the breaking out of closed systems, and his offer to Khrushchev, and you and I have listened to that offer, the recording of the speech at the UN in 1963, just 2 weeks before or 3 weeks before he was murdered, for a U.S.-Russian joint space program to break out of the limits to growth was a big part of that. And Khrushchev's son even admitted that his father wanted to accept it and would have had JFK not been murdered so soon after that speech and that offer. But what a world that would be, how different the world might have been had that not been sabotaged. Then breaking the Five Eyes, the CIA, the FBI. Now JFK passed NSAM 55 in, when was that? That was June 28th, 1961, right after the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the beginning of the ouster of Dulles. 55 basically called for the ending of CIA's covert action, to restore it back to the simple information gathering agency that it was supposed to be in the first place. It was never supposed to be covert action at all. So that would have done that. Now, unfortunately, President Johnson reversed all of these things. But that being said, that was part of JFK's call to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He had to first handicap its covert action capabilities. I mentioned already the ending of the Cold War. There's other things that I'm not going through because there's lack of time. The ending of the war in Vietnam with NSAM 263. Dulles and Lemnitzer had worked to enmesh the USA into a war in Vietnam to replace the French as the colonial enforcer. JFK had a program to begin a phased withdrawal with a full withdrawal by 1965. According to Stars and Stripes coverage in 1963. Now that again was sabotaged and undone by Johnson, who then passed NSAM 273 as soon as JFK was killed, reversing NSAM 263, and then Johnson added NSAM 288, calling for full escalation, which got the U.S. into a 10-year spiritually rotting quagmire of destruction. And importantly, I think here, reviving cultural optimism, the idea of humanity being something that young people in their teens and early 20s could be inspired by through his Army Corps of Engineers, that young people could get living world experience, building wells, getting to know other people, learning other languages in Africa and around the world. That was part of the New Frontiers and the Peace Corps. was really, really important at cultural optimism and enriching people into a real citizen class that could understand how wisdom works and what their responsibilities and duties were to their nation and to their species as a whole. Now, that all had to come undone. The empire can only exist under systems of cultural rot, cynicism, lack of any vision for problem solving. That's the type of culture that the oligarchy needs, that will self-control and self-censor and self-impetize themselves before even any problem solving can begin. It can't be done takes control, right? They're too powerful. There's too much corruption. As soon as that type of thinking cynically becomes normal, nobody's creativity goes to work. Nobody's courage is allowed to blossom, and the empire is happy because we all self-censor and go small. So what did they do? Well, you had an organization set up to murder JFK. This was the Permindex and the Centro Comercial Comercio Mundial. This is a World Trade Center, effectively. Then that's a figure named Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who is a very, very important character in the story, who was a OSS operative who had worked for, who had been trained by the British intelligence. He was based in Montreal. That was the center. And he'd gotten caught trying to run at least 2 assassinations against de Gaulle in 1962. And for that, their Permindex was kicked out of France, just as NATO was kicked out of France by de Gaulle. JFK actually gave de Gaulle full military U.S. support to keep his nation intact against the imperial French forces of the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, the secret army organization of General Maurice Chasles, who was working with these Anglo-American actors. This is Jim Garrison, a book called On the Trail of the Assassins, 1991. He was an advisor of Oliver Stone's film, but this is a good book. And he was the district attorney of New Orleans, who carried out the only jury trial against Clay Shaw in the Permindex CIA operation to kill JFK in 1966 to 68. He was slandered and people. I think he was still the district attorney of New Orleans until 75 or something. But he makes here the point that can't even make it out. So from his book, somebody had been apparently conducting its own foreign policy for some time, had begun a project in Italy, Permindex, as far back as the early 1950s. The organization, named the Centro Mondiale Commerciale, had originally been formed in Montreal, then moved to Rome in 1961. Among the members of its board of directors, we learned today, was one Clay Shaw of New Orleans. As for Permindex, it had, among other things, secretly financed the opposition of the French secret army organization to President de Gaulle's support for independence for Algeria, including its reputed assassination attempts on de Gaulle. One of the major stockholders of the Centro was Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, a Montreal resident and former agent with the Office of Strategic Services, out of which the United States had formed the CIA. That's actually Clay Shaw right here on the left, on the right, with overseeing the Warren Commission report that Alan Dulles had overseen to cover up the real reasons for JFK's murder. So they actually brought in and allowed Clay Shaw to take part in this thing. One of the things that Mortimer Bloomfield did as he was heading Permindex is he was the vice president of the World Wildlife Fund and the co-founder of the 1001 Nature Trust under Prince Philip Mountbatten and Prince Bernhard, the founder of the Bilderberger Group. That's a big deal. And Julian Huxley was another co-founder of the World Wildlife Fund. In 1947, had written that the lowest strata are reproducing relatively too fast. Therefore, they must not have too easy access to relief or hospital treatment, lest the removal of the last check on natural selection should make it too easy for children to be produced or to survive. Long unemployment should be a ground for sterilization. These are eugenicists. And that's why they were creating the World Wildlife Fund, was to bring about a new type of rebranded eugenics of population control under the idea of saving nature from humans. The idea that dams are actually war against nature. Anything that humans do is bad for nature because it creates more overpopulation by having development, and it destroys supposed equilibrium. That's a picture of Maurice Strong, who was also vice president of the World Wildlife Fund right before Mortimer Bloomfield gave up his post. under Prince Philip Mountbatten, the guy who said, I want to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to solve overpopulation. So these are the hardcore murderous Malthusian networks that were taking control, introducing a new ethos to brainwash the young people who had formerly been inspired by JFK's vision. And they had to be given lots of heavy doses of drugs, nihilistic philosophy, a lot of insanity that they went through in order to break their passion for humanity and the belief in scientific and technological progress in favor of this idea that we have limits to growth. We have to adapt like animals to our environment of limits. And thus, all we can do is have increased scarcity. And these are the images of the Limits to Growth Club of Rome document and their computer models showcasing apocalyptic scenarios of resource collapse by the year 2000 if we don't regulate populations under a world government authority now. And on the left is the earlier model of Thomas Malthus, the British imperial philosopher who first scientifically created a justification for depopulation. Now, JFK, I think this is my last slide. Yep, Matt, my last slide. He was very clear on this. And in 1963, he stated to the National Academy of Sciences that he targeted Malthus. He said that Malthus argued a century and a half ago that man, by using up all his available resources, would forever press on the limits of subsistence, thus condemning humanity to an indefinite future of misery and poverty. We can now begin to hope, and I believe know, that Malthus was expressing not a law of nature, but merely the limitation then of scientific and social wisdom. I thought that's pretty important to end on because, again, the technocratic class that's behind Blinken, Sullivan, the entire Klaus Schwabian, operation that's trying to create a one world government is very much obedient to the cult of Malthus, which has been rebranded under transhumanism. It's been rebranded under eugenics. It's been rebranded under environmental conservation, but they're all different aspects of the same insipid satanic ideology, which JFK was very self-consciously fighting against and providing a means to get out of it, which I hope and believe that Trump also is inclined to want to do. And I think that's why his enemies and the enemies of JFK are working so hard to undermine any potential entente and cooperation with China, with Russia, and other countries that want to have a future. So that was my formal remarks, and I'll just launch it out there.
Man, that was great. Really appreciated that. I missed like kind of the core meat of it. I caught the beginning and then obviously caught the end, but like I said, I was having connectivity issues with my phone in the car. It's funny. It's amazing how JFK really is at like the center of all this, how so much of it flows through him. And I mean, I didn't even know about that comment about Malthus. Like, I didn't even know that he like publicly denounced Malthus. That's pretty amazing because I agree with you. I think that the more I've looked into Malthus, the more I realize that it really is a cult built around him. And there's certainly other ideas that I think feed into it. And you talk about the occult, you could talk about more the theological stuff. But it's amazing how the satanic occult theology has morphed into a scientific materialism religion today, which is manifested into environmentalism, the green movement, climate change, like all that nonsense, which is really like the real motive behind it is killing people and population control and bloodlust ultimately. I want to go back. I just want to hit on a few things that I caught throughout the presentation that I think are worth circling back on. The first being the preventative warfare thing. I thought that was fascinating. Where you talk about, you spoke of the cult that formed about wanting to annihilate Russia before they could annihilate us, and cultivating that psyop that Russia was dead set on killing America, so therefore we had to kill them first, which is of course like defined the Cold War. That is preventative warfare, and it is a doctrine that was created by Frederick the Great, the Prussian leader, who came up with the idea of killing your enemy before, like attacking your enemy before they can attack you. And in his old age, he confessed that entire ideology was completely wrong and completely flawed and not a good long-term solution for diplomacy. and will always lead to basically forever wars. And so, and he advocated openly for people to completely abandon it and to throw it in the trash can and say this is a tested model that is a failure. And that's from the mouth of the guy who came up with it. And then, of course, I've talked about before how preventative warfare was combined with von Moltke's, another Prussian general, with his theory about maneuver warfare, where he said, let's use technology, railroads at the time, to move soldiers, move troops around an enemy position, encircle the enemy, cut off their line of communication, cut off their logistics, cut off their supply chain, and starve them out. And then with long-term siege warfare, make it a war of attrition and then force them to surrender on our terms. And so basically you take those two ideas, preventative warfare and maneuver warfare, and you combine them together and you get blitzkrieg. And so that is another Prussian doctrine that was created in World War II by the Nazis for using tanks. And so it's just amazing to see that evolve, because of course the Russians figured out how to beat that using shoulder defense, which I talked about a little bit at GART. And then that transforms into what you just described, this new iteration of preventative warfare, where we have to annihilate Russia before they annihilate us. We have to annihilate the Soviets before they annihilate us. The next thing that I would, and all that ties really into Will Zoll's Prussia Gate, which I think is a awesome series. The one real criticism I would have of it, and I don't even know if it's a criticism, a critique I'd have of it, is just that I think he completely misses the boat on Zionism, the significance of Zionism, dispensationalism, Greater Israel, and he kind of falls into the old trope of like blaming the Islamofascists for everything and adopting the position that the Islamofascists were allies with the Nazis, which of course was not true. Only the ones that were on British payrolls in Jerusalem were the ones that were aligned with the Nazis. What's his name? The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem.
Hajj.
Yeah, him. All the other Arabs, the earnest Arab actors, were actually aligned with the Soviets. They were actually all on Team Russia. And that didn't change throughout the Cold War. So, again, a slight critique of Prussia Gate, but that it's important. I think when you take Prussia Gate, you combine it with your work on the British Empire, you combine it with the stuff that I've found on the Pale of Settlement, and you kind of start to get a full picture that explains how we got to where we are right now. But Africa, you talk about Africa. I mentioned yesterday on Badlands Daily, I didn't get a chance to talk about Africa because we went so deep on specific figures surrounding Trump, namely a Saudi who he was sitting next to at the Mike Tyson fight, who's the head of the PIF, and was a part of MBS's. He was like a lead man in MBS's Saudi royal purge. And the other guy we talked about was Tom Barak, who's the Lebanese real estate tycoon, responsible for putting Jared Kushner in touch with MBS. And I kind of like scratched the surface on Badlands Daily of how many things he's tied to, but he is tied to so much stuff. It's kind of crazy. I might have to do a whole show on him. Seems like a very important figure. And funny enough, the Biden DOJ went after him, charged him with 9 counts of unregistered foreign agent. He beat all of them in court and was found not guilty on all charges. And he was also a senior advisor on the 2016 Trump campaign. So anyway, Africa. So we didn't get to talk about Africa on Balance Daily yesterday, and we're not really going to go deep on it here, but other than just to say that one of the things I had mentioned is that I wanted to see on the show yesterday was that I wanted to see Africa kind of take a central role in the geopolitical narrative, the geopolitical storyline, because I think Africa is extremely important, a lot more important than I had even thought before. And it's interesting that you talk about the JFK, the dam project in, where was that? That was in
Ghana.
In Ghana. Okay. Because that is what you described with JFK doing that and trying to take the Army Corps of Engineers and turn it into kind of a geopolitical force for building bridges rather than like a military force for destroying things. That's a lot of what I see happening in Africa right now with China and Russia. where they're going in there and they're building infrastructure and they are kicking out the imperialists, and they're empowering. I mean, they're getting rich, I'm sure, doing it too, because they're getting access to these resources. So but that's what you want. You want a mutually beneficial situation where not one party is just getting all the benefit. But ultimately what they're doing, I think, if it works out the way that it appears to be, is that they're empowering the Africans to be sovereign and to have their own sovereignty and to rule themselves, and engage in diplomacy on their own terms, rather than being basically controlled by these British CIA, Mossad imperialists. Because the thing that you talked about with him, with what he was trying to do with, what was it, NSA 50, where he wanted, or NAS, yeah. What was it?
Yeah, that was NSAM 55.
NSAM, yes. That, I mean, what you're describing there is the East India Company. That's what the East India Company basically became in 1833, when they basically realized that they didn't really care much about getting into commerce, and the commerce stuff was actually getting them in trouble because there's so many sociopaths in the British East India Company that they were like stealing all this money. And I think technically it was a joint stock venture, so it was some sort of I don't know if it was publicly traded, but it was certainly a joint stock venture. But what was happening is all these guys were siphoning money off the top, and it was getting them in trouble in Parliament because the investors were getting mad that they were in the red, and they're like, we're making so much money, yet we're still falling into bankruptcy. What's going on? And so they were like, you know what? We're just not even going to do commerce anymore because it's getting us in trouble. We're going to surrender our commerce license, which is our commercial trading license, which is what they did in 1833. And so from 1833 to 1873, the East India Company did not trade any commodities. It did no trade whatsoever. The only thing it was allowed to do was raise armies, engage in covert action, like covert espionage, and overthrow governments. And that's basically all it did in Asia. And so, and then in 1873, that's the supporting argument. I think when you look at the guys who were at the head of it in the early 1870s, and the guys who formed the British intelligence apparatus, it's the same guys, same names. So obviously they transform into British intelligence, which then becomes, creates MI5, MI6, CIA, Muslim Brotherhood, Mossad, Islamofascism, all the shiny little objects that we know today. It all kind of comes, it's all fruit of the poisonous tree. And ultimately it's those are the fruits that killed JFK.
Yeah, right. No, that's well said. And that period of 1869 to 1873, that is really a very intense existential period for the British Empire. In my research, that's where you had really a period of total corporate reorganization of every branch of the empire, because there was a recognition that the system that they failed to destroy in America, that Lincoln had died defending, not only came out of the Civil War stronger than ever, but it came out of it with international networks of alliances that recognized the superiority of this American system of political economy to anything that had been sold by the British Empire as the basis of what capitalism should be defined as to the world under British free trade, Malthusian paradigms, which resulted only in the potato famine that killed 2 million or destroyed 2 million people in Ireland, the 25 or so million who died of controlled famine in India. Everywhere it was done, it just created destruction to the people, undermining of the nation's ability to support itself, and the empowerment of the British East India Company and an associated array of corporate influences that were tied to the inner clubs, like what became the United Fruit and things that was sort of that caliber. But everyone was realizing that, no, this thing that Lincoln fought for was and that came out of this American battle of the Battle of Independence was infinitely superior at generating real wealth. That wealth is better defined as what you create industrially, scientifically, that allows you the ability to leap outside of your limits, the way JFK described. And Lincoln's advisors like Henry C. Carey or Erasmus Peshine Smith, who was advising the Meiji government, who was a core Lincoln economist, or the people around Sergei Witte in Russia, or von Bismarck, who had a lot of American system advisors in Germany helping him do the Zollverein, the customs union. They were all recognizing that, no, it's what you can build based on win-win cooperation with your neighbors, industrial development internally, the idea of increasing manufacturing instead of allowing for cheap labor exports or raw materials extraction as your sole basis of value. And it was working at breaking nations free of the system of hereditary power and the dependency on the British Empire's near monopoly of shipping, which the British, that's how they were able to control, is they keep everybody underdeveloped and addicted to port cities and exports that the British controlled the ports for, the world choke points. And that's how the empire was global. And so when people started developing their internal resources through rail development and thus opening up things like, the frontiers of America or of Russia through the Trans-Siberian Railway, that liberated these nations from that dependency and made them much more sovereign, much more internally coherent. And that had to be destroyed. But the empire was not confident that they were going to survive this threat to their existence, because it was so polarizingly electric and good. And they did this massive reorganization. It's almost I'm bewildered, honestly, in my studies of this thing. I'm bewildered, and in a disgusting way, I find it impressive what they did, as far as creating these new think tanks that forced a corporate restructuring, new management, things like the Huxley X Club was created in 1865, the Fabian Society, the Theosophical Society in 1875, the Fabian Society in 1874, then the Roundtable movement of, Lord Gascoigne Cecil and the Cecil faction as well, that were bringing that thing on. So all these think tanks were set up, the British Society for Psychical Research, for the spiritual parapsychological warfare branch, and they just sort of revamped everything. And yeah, the British East India Company was like seen as being too, what do you call it? When too many people were aware of the evil of the thing and they understood the nature of it. So they were like, this is too much of a liability. That's the word, a liability. And they were like, okay, we have to get rid of that structure and move its functions over to something else, which is what you've been describing. And it wasn't just the British Empire, right? It was like all of these inner families and interlocking hereditary institutions that go back to the Teutonic Knights, that go back to the Knights Templar, that go back to the Knights of Malta, which were these Gnostic mystery cults that oversaw the Crusades, that were the heirs of the Gnostic, cults that had infiltrated Christianity, but that were still doing the exact same worshiping and child sacrifice and, sacred orgies using narcotics to help the spiritual experience of their initiates that was being done by the cult of Isis in Egypt, as well as in Rome and Mithra and Cybele. And it's the same thing. They were just retooling these things. And that's what the Templars, the Malta Knights, the Teutonic Knights, that were they were basically pagans in Christian disguise for the stupid masses, but in the inner core believed always in pagan mystery cults as their true belief. And that's what was revived under Hitler. If you look at Heinrich Himmler and the whole Thule Society, it was like this Viking, Odin worshipping pantheon that needed to have a Christian veneer for the stupid masses who weren't strong enough to recognize what
you're seeing all over 4chan, like you see that today, is like this reverence of Odin and reverence of like the Tree of Life, and
I'm seeing a lot of that too. Yeah,
like the Black Sun stuff, and like the all the pagan occult stuff. And that is part of the I think the white supremacy psyop that they're pushing. Because of course there's the Christian nationalism psyop, which is also they try to tie to white supremacy. But just having seen it for myself, it's on like 4chan and stuff. There's a lot of like the old German Thule Society pagan occult white supremacy stuff also. I think it's all those are all just different flavorings, I think, of the same thing that probably is all tied to some sort of a psyop. But and of course, psyops are only effective if they have earnest actors. So people always try to say, well, this guy is an earnest actor and this guy's it's like, yeah, but because that's what makes the psyop real, is when you can get people to buy into it and get them to promote it in earnest. That's what makes it, that's what takes it from something really artificial to something that's a lot more authentic. The two dynamics that I think really confuse people and confuse me as well. And, you know, our challenges when you're trying to analyze history and analyze these stories is the idea of infiltration, not invasion, like the idea of infiltrating something good and then turning into something bad, like the French Revolution would be one example. And then also, like you said, liabilities. Like when something becomes a liability, they then destroy it and or allow it to die or allow it to be reborn in some fashion, right? And so people, I think, look at things that they maybe thought were good or maybe thought were bad, and then they say, oh, well, it was destroyed by the good people, so it must have been bad, or it was destroyed by the people who I perceived as being bad, so it must have been good, right? So those are all the kind of like the dynamics that I think people get stuck on, where they're like, well, because they're trying to assign some sort of a moral compass to the whole, like to navigate the story of history, right? You know, with this good versus evil thing, and that gets a little murky because there's so many shades of gray and there's so many independent operators, people operating and people changing allegiances, and things, you know, good things becoming bad, bad things becoming good.
Yeah.
Bad people fighting bad people. I mean, that happens. Good people maybe fighting good people. I mean, that happens too. So that's where I think it gets really muddy, and it's hard to, that's why I think it's important to not to try your best not to, when you're looking at like evaluating geopolitics, get too deep into like the good guy, bad guy paradigm, because it's a little cartoonish and it becomes a little bit too of a comic book. Although I do think that there is a good versus evil element. And that's what when I get back, bringing it full circle to JFK, that's why it's funny that JFK seems to be at the center of all of this, because there is like, despite all of his human flaws, there is like a moral center to him, and what he was trying to accomplish that was obviously the reason that he was destroyed. I think we can all agree on that. Whether we may differ on who killed him and who was involved and how it happened, I think everyone understands that it was because he was morally righteous in what he was trying to ultimately accomplish. And one of the things I'd point to there is the meeting he had with the Saudis in 1961, where he promoted basically what we would call socialism. He encouraged them to engage in socialism by taking their wealth and investing it in their people. But I thought about this a lot since I learned that months ago, maybe a year ago. I've just thought about that a lot. And especially since we've been talking about McKinley and talking about tariffs and talking about ways to fund government. I mean, the paradigm has always been here in America is that if you are pro public works, if you're pro, public programs and public works, you're a communist or a socialist, because you want to use the government as a vehicle to accomplish things, or you want to use public money as a vehicle to accomplish things. And that requires, because of how we've been indoctrinated, the extraction of wealth and energy from the people in the form of taxation, right? But if you look at it, if you flip it on its head and you look at a tariff-funded government, and what tariffs ultimately are, is it's you create a really, really attractive marketplace where outsiders, foreigners, want to bring their goods to your market, and you charge them a premium to do that. And then that premium, that tax that you're charging foreigners, not your own people, becomes the thing that you use to fund your government and fund potentially these public programs. And if you think about it that way, then it's not an extraction. You're not stepping on the throat of your people and pulling life force out of them in order to create something. You're building something up. You're establishing a higher level of prosperity that then attracts money from outside external places, and that money that's being brought in is then used to further elevate your people with public money. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, the idea of an Army Corps of Engineer going around the world and building bridges, building dams, building things in places that don't have them, so that those people can then lift themselves up and engage in the quote unquote world marketplace, not globalism, but just the world marketplace.
It kills me that we have to sort of like preemptively sort of have these disclaimers for the language, the limits of the language. Because it's like, we shouldn't have to, like, people, we live in the world, and no matter what, we live in the world. And so the fact that there would be some commerce between countries doesn't make somebody a globalist shill, just like doing tariffs doesn't make somebody an economic isolationist. It's not mutually exclusive. You can have both tariffs and honest, fair trade with your neighbors. It's like that shouldn't be more like that should be an elementary fact that we should all be like, oh yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, last night when I was writing my news brief takes late, my wife was I was in bed with my wife, and she was watching a movie. It was like a 2004 movie. I don't even remember what it was called, but it was like Topher Grace and Dennis Quaid and Scarlett Johansson, very, very young Scarlett Johansson. And, you know, the movie was like an old trope. And this is a trope that I realized, like, kind of watching out of the corner of my eye as I'm writing. It's about, you know, a guy who works for an old man, like a middle-aged guy who works for a magazine. And then the young guy comes in and takes his job, and he gets demoted and works for the young guy. And it's like the corporation coming and acquiring the smaller business and then installing their own people and just kind of it losing its humanity and that whole trope. But there was like this scene in it where like the Elon Musk figure, like the Bill Gates Elon Musk figure, the guy who started the corporation, like comes and visits the peons, right? And they're like, oh my God, this guy's here. He's going to give a speech. And he starts getting up and like just opining on like synergy and like all that, which now, like looking back 20 years ago, I mean, they're making fun of it in the movie. Like they're like, this guy's a clown. But looking back, it's almost such a cliche that it's such a caricature now, like that word synergy and all those stupid corporate words. But he said this line where he was like, imagine a manufacturing process where one part comes from India, one part comes from Belgium, one part comes from America, one part and like as if this is some noble thing, as if it's like a noble thing to build something where every single part that goes into like into the whole comes from a different country in the world. And like somehow that thing you're making then takes on some sort of a sacred divine power. And then the middle-aged guy stands up and is like, that's bullshit. Like what you just said. He's like, I don't understand anything you just said. What you just said is a bunch of bullshit. You know, and then kind of like the movie goes back to being wholesome at the end. And that's like the moral story, like the moral, like redemption arc of the movie. And that movie was 20 years old. Like 20 years ago, we were making movies like that, where we openly recognize that the corporate asshole who does that stuff, who has that thinking, is the bad guy. Like he's the bad guy. And that thinking of taking parts from different countries and then assembling them at like in a plant in Idaho is not a good thing. Like that's actually a bad thing.
Yeah, right. Well, that's where this question of discernment is so important, because I remember like listening to a wonderful speech by Martin Luther King Jr. on the interconnectedness, just going through like a little example of how when you wake up in the morning and you got your bread that comes from Nevada and, you know, from your toast, and then you get some coffee that came from like Guatemalan beans, and he's going through this thing in a very poetic way to get people to just appreciate that there is this web of interconnectivity that ties us as individuals to the broader species. And it's true. But you can see how this could be perverted as well by those who want to create a destruction of sovereignty, right? Because you could do that the way the globalizers do, where they say, okay, if we won't do any finished good in one country. We'll have, like you said, we'll break it all apart so nobody can do everything themselves. And then you don't have any sovereign country because everybody is dependent upon, like, you know, the spark plugs come from this other country and but if you actually have fair trade, which you can get by having, like, not free trade necessarily, and free trade is not always a bad thing either. Neither, just like protectionism isn't always a good thing. Sometimes you want to always be flexible with these things, because at a certain point, it's like once you've incubated your industry that didn't exist because you gave protective you favored local manufacturing by utilizing a protective tariff to block the dumping of cheap goods from abroad. So at a certain point, you start walking. Like, you needed that just to, like, get the space to crawl, to learn to walk, to build the capacity. Once you have the capacity, now you have wealth creation. So now you are in a position to compete with those who also have that same wealth creation capacity on a free trade basis. Like that becomes good competition. So you can start lowering your protective tariff because now goods will be produced more cheaply as you've gotten better at it. And that's the thing that Adam Smith, I think that's a sleight of hand in my analysis, because there's a lot of good things you can't refute in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. But the thing that he ignores is he pretends mathematically that all things are equal. So he doesn't actually describe how a nation can have wealth. He just presumes that all nations are these finished products, and then starts building up a whole theory of global free trade, with a whole bunch of notions of interest and pricing and other things that come out of that. But it's like, you never proved how a nation could develop the industry. You just presume that they're all capable of competition, and they're not. Most nations have been kept down by empire artificially to be
slave castes.
Yeah. So how do they stand on their own 2 feet and build up their industry in the first place, so that then maybe your theories can go into play? But no. And I think that's the Delphic sleight of hand. That's the magician's trick, which is why Adam Smith was employed by Lord Shelburne of the British East India Company. I don't think that there was necessarily an honest intention to infusing that matrix of how to think about organizing your economy, which demanded no protectionism. And of course, there is something to be aware of, that if you have protectionism, or something is powerful that can organize a civilian or an Army Corps of Engineers, that implies political national power. That means that you have to be able to keep that in check, because if that becomes corrupted, that level of power that can organize protective tariffs, then that could be used to enslave and destroy your own people if it's captured by the enemies of the nation. Which people have to.
Yeah. Well, which, by the way, what you just described is what the executive branch in the federal government is now. When you look at what the EPA is, when you look at what the FDA is, when you look at what all these different agencies are, they all the FAA. They're all regulatory bodies that prevent small businesses from being able to compete with corporations, because in order to compete with the corporations, you have to have a massive administrative body, a bureaucracy, to do the paperwork in order to satisfy all of the obstacles that the government, the regulators throw at you to make sure you're in compliance, right? And a lot of times those requirements are silly, they're foolish, they don't make any sense. They're very redundant. I mean, all of it's very, very silly. It's stuff that would be solved in the free market just from common sense and best practice, that you don't need like a checks and balance necessarily to resolve. I mean, there's certain things that you are, like working in construction and building. There are definitely situations where you're going to want to make sure that somebody is building a building and they're giving it to somebody else. You want to make sure that there's certain things that they're not cutting corners, because I know contractors, and that incentive is certainly there. Mm-hmm. So there is definitely like a gray area, like an area where moderation, I think, is the best way to look at it. You want moderation. You don't want to go too far into one thing, but that kind of gets back to what the free market is supposed to be about. The free market is supposed to be about options. If I don't have options, then I don't live in a free market. If I have 2 airlines that I can pick from to fly out from my city, those aren't options. Yeah, that's Pepsi and Coke. Those aren't options. I should have 10 airlines or really infinite number of airlines to pick from to fly out from my city, or maybe take the train, or maybe take the boat, or maybe drive my car. Like, the more options I have, the better, the more healthy an economy you have, the better it is for everybody. Certainly, like, the less monopoly you're going to have, but the monopolists don't like that, because they like their monopoly. They like to be rich. They like to be the oligarch. And so just defeating those people, unseating them, and then establishing conditions so that they can never return to power, is basically the crux of what this whole moment that we're in right now is about. People want to boil it down to like a specific geopolitical issue or a specific religious issue, and it's a lot bigger than that. We can certainly engage in all those issues, and I feel like I've educated myself enough that I can have those debates and earnestly argue one point or another based on first principles, based on like a sound moral standing, which I would ultimately accredit to, being Christian and having that Christian, like the Christian value. But that same value system, as General Quast pointed out during one of our panels at GART, the 10 commandments, you can basically find the 10 commandments in every single society around the world that's almost ever existed, you will find some form of the 10 Commandments, because that is just the universal truth that humans come up with when they organize and when they act in earnest in their own best interest. They ultimately develop a system that reflects in some fashion the 10 Commandments.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, and I think that's like the most important thing is like we in the West have, I think, gotten into some bad habits of only reading philosophical or religious texts that reinforce our own relationship to our own matrix that we come out of. And we're not accustomed so much to reading the philosophical text of other cultures or their history. So that creates all of these blind spots that the enemies of humanity capitalize on when they build their hypnotic trance inductions and propaganda mechanisms to weaponize us, to give our acquiescence to go to war with, let's say, the Islamic world because 9/11, or China because we love democracy, or whatever, right? And it's true. Like you read, I was reading through the Analects with a group, like the Confucian Analects from like 500 BC, and it's the teachings of Confucius. And yeah, the golden rule is right there, except in the form of a negation, like do not unto others as you would not have anyone do unto you. And it's literally that. Like it's a discovery of natural law that as soon as you try to coexist in an honest way in society, you will come to certain discoveries about moral reason that work very well, much better than an eye for an eye. Somebody slighted me, I have to slight them back 5 times or something. Like that never works. That always results in the same degenerative, pay it forward in a bad way, decay process. And empires always utilize those techniques to get us to stupidify ourselves, to fight amongst ourselves. They love it, and to make ourselves more dumb. But like you said, it's there. It's, if you look at read the Quran, you'll find these brilliant gems of universal wisdom that run parallel to the same gems of universal wisdom you'll find in the New Testament, and you'll find it in the Torah.
You'll find the 10 Commandments in the Quran, and then the companion piece I've learned to the Quran is the Injil. I think I'm saying that right, which is the Gospel of Luke, which is the New Testament. So it's it's and that's the other thing. I mean, eye for an eye. That's Hammurabi's code. That's ancient Babylon. And you're right, like the whole vengeance, like I have to get vengeance for what you did to me. We did a retribution panel at GART where we talked about like what does retribution look like in the context of going after the deep state, you know, and we don't need to talk about what was actually discussed there, but what really I think changed it, what got us out of that paradigm of like the Hammurabi's code, the eye for an eye, which really defined Western civilization in like the Middle East and the Mediterranean in the early days, like the law code, the code of law, codified law was defined by Hammurabi's code, was the New Testament. It was the idea of mercy and grace and forgiveness, which by the way, you can find in Eastern religions as well. You can find that in plenty of Eastern religions, the idea of being the bigger person and walking away and forgiving and not seeking vengeance and not being the last one to strike, which is really defining what is happening right now in the Middle East, by the way, where this idea where, well, they did this to me, so now I have to do something to them, otherwise I lose face. That's pride, that's ego, that's revenge. Those are all the things that we are taught as children really not to engage in. And here you have like the most powerful leaders in the world engaging in that, like children. And we have to break out of that. And I think when we move into the real multipolar world, if we do it the right way and we achieve the vision that I think a lot of people have been talking about from different cultures, you really do focus on prosperity and not on conflict and not on war. And people will stop looking at it like, well, what are those guys over there up to? Like how are they trying to kill us today? Like that kind of thinking that I think drives conflict. And not to make it about Bitcoin, because there were a few panels that weren't about Bitcoin that became about Bitcoin because G Money was on them. But G Money made a great point. I don't remember if he made it on stage or if he made it just to me in private. But he talked about And I don't know if he does a good job of doing this in public or not, but basically he talked about how what Bitcoin does is that if everyone's invested in Bitcoin, China and America, for example, China has a boon. They have they're in like an upcycle of their economy, and everyone there invests in Bitcoin, buys Bitcoin. It drives up the price of Bitcoin, which elevates the wealth of the people who own Bitcoin in America. America then has the boon, and the same thing happens there, and then back and forth it goes. And no matter who's having the boon, this currency, whether it's Bitcoin or something else, if everyone's using this currency and has access to it, it can elevate the wealth of everyone. It also eliminates or discourages kinetic warfare, because if you're China and you go blow up a nuclear power plant or any kind of power plant in America, you're now destroying their Bitcoin or destroying their ability to harness energy, which then lowers your value, like the value of Bitcoin for everyone. It was very like when I started thinking about it like that, he's like, so if you look at it like this, soft war, which is what Jason Lowery calls it, the guy who wrote the white paper on it. If we are able to shift into that mindset, you could almost look at it as like an end to kinetic warfare. I mean, it doesn't mean there's not going to be conflict. The conflict will just come in different forms: information warfare, economic warfare, etc. But you start to eliminate the desire to destroy things, because by destroying something in a foreign country, you could be hurting yourself if everyone is operating in a real global economy, not a globalist economy, if that makes sense. And so I think that there's like some real, like thinking about things in those terms and thinking about things like that way. I think the point that I made on the consent to govern panel, because G Money and I run that together, is that, one of the defining transformations that occurred in the American Revolution is real estate. That's what really, because I think people get really hung up on this idea of like digital currency and like Bitcoin and like, how is that going to solve other problems? And it's not about the one thing. It's not about Bitcoin in particular. It's about an asset class that fundamentally transforms the way a society thinks, the way a society philosophize, like the philosophy of a society, the way people think. And the example that I would give is real estate. Real estate in Europe, even today, it functions to a certain degree, but real estate prior to the American Revolution was all based on a feudal system where the king had everything. He slices it up into blocks. He hands it out to his underlings. The underlings then slice up their blocks into smaller blocks, and so on and so forth. And then you have a pyramid at the end of it with the king at the top. And everyone has an obligation to pay their taxes to the guy above. And if they miss their tax payment, they lose their title, they lose their castle, they lose their land, and it's given to somebody else. And of course, the land comes with armies and farms and resources and all that. And so that's how real estate was done. Like all real estate belonged to the king, and it was bequeathed to the guy beneath them. The reason that Thomas Jefferson originally wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Property is because the idea was that the government, the king, didn't own your land in America. You owned your land, and nobody could take it from you. They'd have to kill you to take it from you with kinetic warfare. And that idea fundamentally transformed the world because it took possession of property and gave people their sovereignty with it, because they weren't reliant on a higher power, a higher secular power to own something. They could own it themselves, care for it themselves, maintain it themselves. And that completely changed the economy. It completely changed the way people looked at one another. It changed the way people formed governments. It changed the way people thought about the world. And it was an asset class. That's what it was. It was an asset class. So, I think when you frame it through that, you can look at something like the emerging technologies. I won't even say Bitcoin. I'll just say the emerging technologies that we're about to witness, hopefully, as a vehicle that could fundamentally not just change our economies and change our standards of living, but also change the way we think about things and the way that we engage with one another and the way we do diplomacy and the way we think about warfare. And, like I see people in the chat saying that I'm getting swept up in the idealism. And yes, I am getting swept up in the idealism, because there's an opportunity here to forever change society if we do this the right way. And I'm not saying it's Bitcoin or any specific thing. I'm saying it's a collective effort of having options, and whatever the best option is, we should be allowed to pursue that without hindrance or regulation from secular powers, whether that thing is Bitcoin or whether it's some other technology or some other idea. We should be allowed to go after it without other people telling us we're not allowed to do that because of XYZ. And remember, the world was a dark, brutal place before the American Revolution, before the Enlightenment. The world was like Europe was a much darker and more brutal place. And then the Enlightenment happened and it became a little better. And then the American Revolution happened and that inspired a different standard of expectation and sovereignty and how people thought about themselves and thought about their ability to self-organize. So I think those are things that we should be thinking about all the time, because if we don't have a fundamental transformation of our ethos and our zeitgeist in this process we're going through right now, there is a real danger of us being led back into the slaughterhouse by bad actors.
I would agree with the gist of that. Yeah. I mean, my sense of John Locke and the whole idea that Locke had played a positive role in terms of the foundation of America. He certainly played an influence in Jefferson's thinking, that's for sure. He had a bust of John Locke in his house, and Adam Smith. But I'm not such a big fan of that one. I do think of John Locke as an evil Gnostic Satanist.
Yeah.
But in the all principled terms of what you've just said, I do agree with. I should actually just back that up just to make a point. I guess is the thing with Locke. I was doing a bit of a dive, not to deflect again, because it's super important what you just said, and we do have to stay diligent and appreciate the high ideals and ideas of the American founding republic, because it's true. Everything that came before that break in history was infinitely worse for the vast majority of people who had far less potential to live a life of that was far removed in qualitative terms from a talking cow under a feudal lord's plantation. And that's the American Revolution completely changed that. And the philosophical ideas associated with that are gold. So the balance of those high ideals with a practical political fight are extremely important. And that's sort of this if you look at some of like the major battles throughout history, there's this concept that St. Augustine had, that Plato had, that Christ also taught, that there's sort of there's two aspects of reality. There's the bodily reality, and then there's the reality of eternal truths, where the divine, our soul, which is immortal, we can have confidence that our immortal soul partakes in that higher realm, where things like justice, not like the unbounded, but principled, simple ideas like justice, like the concepts of peace, of harmony, exist, and that define and create the basis of the bounding conditions of the material world that we live in, as far as that which is bounded with beginning, middle, and end in space and time. There's a before I was born and after my body will die, an outside of myself and inside of myself. And you got that for every object. But then that's important to think about the practical aspect of life, especially geopolitically, like realpolitik, right? Like, okay, we gotta live in the world where there's bad actors, bad agencies. You gotta like,
you have to be a realist. Like you have to be,
you got to be a realist.
Pragmatic. Yeah.
It's useless. Like there's that statement that, there, some people are too, a friend of mine in Alberta brought this to my attention. I love it. That some people are so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
But it doesn't mean
I grew up surrounded by those people. So I can tell you that like, I know that type very, very well. Very, very well.
Yeah. But then there's certain people who are so earthly grounded that they're no heavenly good either.
Yes. Cynics. I mean, you're basically describing a cynic there, which defines Western civilization in the post-war era, and the post-World War II era is defined by cynicism. That is what led to the degradation of our culture, the degradation of our values. Everything that we have lost since the 1950s per se, all came as a product of cynicism. Which is this idea of, which basically is nihilism, and this idea of like detaching yourself from what I think some people would call idealism. The American Revolution was defined by idealism, what they accomplished and what they did. And I told the story of Patrick Henry's speech during, in the consent to govern panel, we basically had Patrick Gunnels and G Money on stage, and they were about to kill each other because they got in a huge argument in the panel earlier over Bitcoin. and then they were on stage together and they were about to kill each other. And so I explained the story of, March 19th, 1775, when all of the landowners of Virginia met at St. John's Church. And George Washington called a meeting and he said, we got to figure this out. Massachusetts is basically a powder keg about to explode. They're under imperial occupation, and the Sons of Liberty up there want to launch a revolution. They're asking us to help them. Without Virginia helping them, there is no war. Virginia has all the intellects. It has all of the military leaders. It has all the wealth. It has the land that can grow the food. Without Virginia's participation, there is no American Revolution. Are we in or are we out? And so that's what they're trying to figure out at this meeting. There were three groups that were there. There were the landed gentry and these guys who owned like entire counties. I mean, swaths of land that we can't even imagine these days. Like these guys are the closest things to the feudal oligarchs of Europe. Their cousins were the oligarch, like the aristocrats, and these are the second sons, the guys who were the second born and had no right to their castles and titles at home. So they came to America with all their money bought land. The second group were the intelligentsia, the academics, the Thomas Jefferson, the doctors, the lawyers, the smart people who owned, smaller plantations, farms, but nothing like what the land gentry had. But they were highly educated, the political leaders, those guys. And then the third group, which the landed gentry didn't even want there. Landed gentry said, we don't even want these guys here. These are the blacksmiths, the artisans, the guys who owned little tiny plots of land, like suburban sized plots of land with their blacksmith shop, maybe a little garden that they use to feed their family. But they're peasants in the eyes of these other guys. And they're like, we don't want these guys. They are not welcome. And George Washington said, nope, these guys are the backbone of our society. They make the things we use every day. They are very important to this process. They got to be here. And so they're brought into the meeting, and their leader is a lawyer. So even though he was a lawyer, he also was a farmer, and he split his time between being a lawyer and being a farmer, which is why his law career never really exploded. And that was Patrick Henry. And the place devolves into a fight. Everyone's sitting there arguing. They're at each other's throats. It looks like it's going off the rails. And then George Washington asks Patrick Henry to say something, to salvage the moment. And Patrick Henry gets up and gives totally impromptu, without any notes. The only reason we know what he said is because there were so many people there taking notes while he spoke. And then they took all the notes from various people and combined them. And we have like a slightly accurate representation of what he said. But he basically gives this super inspiring speech where he looks at the landed gentry and he says, you think that you are masters of this world, these colonies, but you are slaves. You men live in chains, and your masters are over there in Britain, and you will never be free men because you will always be beholden to your cousins back in London who will extract as much wealth as they want from you on any given day. And ends it with give me liberty or give me death. It doesn't resolve all the differences. It doesn't resolve all of their arguments. They continue to argue for decades. We're still having the same arguments they were having in that room today, right now. But the idealism of that speech is what brought them all together to look at each other in the eye and say, you know what? We have a greater enemy. We can put aside our differences for now and figure those out later. Yes, we're going to war. And that vote of confidence is what led to the Battle of Lexington and Concord a month later, when the British came for the guns, and Paul Revere and the Sons of Liberty rallied the men and led the first battle of the American Revolution. That then spawned the entire rebellion worldwide against the British Empire and against empire in general, which we are still fighting today. And that all started on a speech about idealism. So if we abandon idealism and we don't strive to be something greater, then we are basically going to become cynics. We're going to become Diogenes, living in a pot on the side of the road in our own filth, talking to rabid wild dogs, which is basically what American society is right now.
Yeah, we've definitely fallen pretty far down the aesthetical, intellectual dumpster heap compared to the you even read the writings from children's books in the 1870s, 1880s, and it's challenging for an adult educated reader today to follow what kids under the age of 12 were customarily reading for kids' books over a century ago. and the quality of what we expect out of ourselves and out of our society is so low. We should be, you know, just because we're like a blue collar worker or whatever, doesn't mean that we shouldn't expect the same quality, if not higher quality, probably higher quality of intellectual cognitive power than farmers living 200 years ago, who were able to read. Like people, I gave Thomas Paine's Common Sense to a friend and they said, I can't follow it. It's like, this is Thomas Paine's frigging Common Sense, the thing that organized the majority of Americans to understand why and how they should fight for this cause of liberty. And I mean, it's a pamphlet. It was spread out across America. People were reading it in groups. They were studying it, thinking about it, rereading it. And today, where all of this technology and we've got more years spent in the education system, and we can't read it without going to sleep after page 2. It's really jar. Or even listening to, like, you know, Mozart, a friend of the American Revolution. Mozart was a Republican who was trying to awaken the Promethean spark in Europeans, and was totally inspired, as was Beethoven, by the experience of the American Republicans. And their musical work was designed with that fire in themselves, and that was something they wanted to inculcate and awaken inside of their listeners. But today, you try to like find a good performance of a symphony by Beethoven, or like the Fifth Symphony or the Ninth Symphony or the Seventh, or any of them, or a Mozart piece of the Requiem. And I mean, people don't have the concentration span because of social media, Twitter activity, whatever. The whole culture is designed by these social engineers of Tavistock to destroy and fragment our concentration span. They've already taken away things like the study of Latin, Greek that our forefathers had access to. They could read Greek and Latin. That was a common thing, but learning other languages also expands your cognitive powers, your ability to listen to a 45, 60-minute piece of music and thinking about where is it going? Where is it taking the mind? There's no repetitive beats. There's themes, but there's no repetitive beats like there is in the, top 40 revolution of music back in the 50s and 60s and onward, that all just have repetitive beats, repeatedly intoned, which puts your mind into a bit of a droozing off, turn off switch, where then you're more susceptible to taking in messaging that might be there in the lyrics that you might not even be paying attention to in your waking mind, but that's being seeped in under the sentinels, the sleeping sentinels of your reason. All of a sudden you're taking in things that you didn't even realize you might be listening to with either Led Zeppelin, who, by the way, Jimmy Page is a big Aleister Crowley Satanist, biggest repository of Aleister Crowley memorabilia in the world. There's messaging that they're constantly bringing into color, as well as in the movies and things like that. Our subconscious, our idea of the imagination, our idea of our imagination's sense of the future, of the past, of what human nature is, all of these things are being shaped and sculpted by cultural influences that are being directed by, again, Tavistockian psychiatrists, social engineers operating through the CIA. It's not a new thing. This has been going on for a while. Yep. And so by becoming aware of those subtle influences, we can then become we could take what is unconscious, make it an object of conscious analysis that we could then separate from influencing our own decision-making and identity by will. So the free will can then come into play. We can become we can earn the right to be free, sovereign agents by making those types of decisions to say, I'm going to be the better part of myself that the oligarchy didn't want me to be. That's what I'm going to fight to bring about. And I'm going to do work that's more mentally heavy lifting, but I'm going to build the bigger muscles, the bigger concentration span, the memory powers by doing the sorts of things that Benjamin Franklin was doing. I'm going to read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. I'll do the hard work. I'll read.
Well, Benjamin Franklin was an idealist, so I don't know if you should.
Yeah, it's great, right? You just to be able to walk in both worlds. It's something. That whole city of God also manifests in the city of man, and that the city of man has to always have as a model like some ideal of what the tapestry of God's natural law expects of us. And to the degree that we hold that, we have a guiding post that we can make compromises, like JFK did when he did his Profiles in Courage. I don't know if anybody gets a chance to read JFK's Profiles in Courage before he became president. It's a fantastic read where he does like an analysis of 5 key figures like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and I'm forgetting the other ones, John Quincy Adams. But he's doing like an analysis of real living history and like men who had moral principles, who had to make compromises. In some cases, they fucked up, and they gave up too much. And in other cases, they were able to hold on to their moral principles and still give to the side of ignorance of ignorant players that they needed to operate with in order to get an effect that would then increase the potential for the good, for the manifestation of the ideals of the American Revolution decades after the war was over. The revolution was not over yet. The ideals were just there on paper, but it takes time. It's an ongoing forever process to manifest those.
Yeah. Well, just to be clear to everyone listening, I was being completely facetious when I just said that about Franklin. People in the chat, there's some people in the chat who are dooming out a little bit, blackpilling a little bit because of Donald Trump's appointments of the pro-Zionist appointments, which I would encourage them to go listen to Badlands Daily from yesterday. I gave my take on that yesterday. Chris Paul and I talked about it last week, and the short version of it, the Cliff Notes version of it, is that the signal on that, just for people who aren't gonna have time to go listen to it, is he got all of the Zionist pro-Israel appointments in on one day. He did it all on last Tuesday. And the guy who started it, he appointed his Israeli ambassador before he appointed his Secretary of Defense, his Secretary of State, any of it. He appointed Mike Huckabee. I mean, the fact that he appointed his Israeli ambassador first before any of his major other appointments felt like a troll against like Nick Fuentes and that whole crew. But the fact that he appointed Mike Huckabee is pure signal, because Mike Huckabee is a voracious Zionist, where he for 20 years has said Palestine isn't even a real thing. It doesn't even exist. What are we even talking about? It's already Israel. Like there's not even a war that needs to be fought because Israel already has it. It already legally belongs to Israel. So the Arabs who live there can either be Israeli citizens or they can go live somewhere else, or we should actually carve up another country and form a new Palestine and send them all there. That's what he's said on camera. And he's been saying that for 20 years. The fact that Donald Trump in this geopolitical moment picked that guy to be the Israeli ambassador, to me, because Donald Trump is a brilliant man and he obviously is aware of all those comments, is a chess move. Because first of all, how that's going to be received around the world is exactly what you would think. And unless Donald Trump already has conversations, lines of communication with those other actors, those other players, and has already lined up a game plan, he can't make that appointment without really, really provoking things. So obviously there's something else happening there. I will point out that McGregor did say the other day that Israel and Russia are going to war. He said that's absolutely inevitable. That's something I said like 3 months ago, just reading the tea leaves. And I think that this is going to play out in a way where we are going to see an accelerated narrative of heightened escalation. We're going to see a nuclear scare event between Russia and the United States. We're going to see something happening in the Middle East, probably Syria, I think is most likely the battlefield, where all the actors from the Ukraine war, from the Taiwan conflict, everywhere, they're all already physically present in Syria, including China. China's on the in the Persian Gulf, anchored in the Persian Gulf, protecting the Iranian oil supply lines. I think we're going to see that escalate into something that demands resolution. And the faster it escalates narratively, not kinetically, but narratively, the kinetic part can't catch up. And I think we will see a worldwide demand for resolution, which will probably require some sort of interventionism into Israel, just like we have seen in Ukraine, where we will probably see, my guess would be the Russian military going into Israel and removing the cartel, which in my opinion is the same cartel that controls Washington, D.C. So I see this all as like a giant game theory model where Donald Trump is still playing chess right now. He's still engaged in game theory, both against the bad actors in America, but also the bad actors in Brussels and the bad actors in Tel Aviv, the bad actors in Kiev. But all that's to say that we have to maintain our idealism, because once that conflict is resolved, and I think it will be resolved, on what time scale, like we'll see. There's a world that has to be built after that. Yeah. And it's not like what we have right now is going to go away. The banking system we have right now is going to go away. the economic financial models that we have right now in the West are going to go away. They've already been proven to be not only fraudulent, but completely inadequate. They don't operate and function. Even the people who ostensibly support it have said that it's a failure and that we have to abandon it and we have to go do something else. And so what we pivot to will be decided by either the oligarchs or by people like us. But if we don't start having those conversations now and talking about what is possible, then the oligarchs will be the ones who will be making those decisions for us. And you will be led right back into the slaughterhouse that you were facing back when Obama was the president.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Once again, in general terms, I'm a little less optimistic in some ways, but I think it's important to, like, I encourage people when a policy is a bad policy to speak up. And, I'm of the view that Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, for example, are occult evil actors. I think that they're agents. I'm not for the idea that they're good. So I'm coming at it from that hypothesis that there's a lot more problems in infiltration to co-opt the good. But I do believe Trump's a good man, and I think he's got good people. That's my approach. So
I used to also think that. I used to also think that Elon was a bad actor, but I look at some of the like that he comes from the occult because he has background that suggests that, and there's certainly certain testimonies from certain people that reinforce that narrative. But you can't help but wonder, has he turned on those people? Because some of the stuff he's been saying and doing lately would certainly suggest that. And I think some people get hung up on, well, how come he hasn't done enough? It's like he's gone halfway, but there's still censorship on Twitter. Well, I think there's still cartel members in DC who still have their hand on the steering wheel. I still think that.
What about Peter Thiel? What do you think about him?
I mean, he's a total enigma too, because he's developed things like what's it called, Pegasus, right? I mean, what wasn't he Pegasus? He's developed stuff like Pegasus and software like that. But he also was involved in the takedown of the Silicon Valley Bank, which was obviously being used for some sort of child trafficking, human trafficking operation, because Oprah Winfrey had $600 million in cash sitting in that bank. Why? Why would Oprah Winfrey have $600 million sitting in a bank account instead of invested in the marketplace or like parked somewhere? I mean, that is some of the most ridiculous financial advice that you could possibly. I mean, that's something that the dumbest person in the world would do. Would take $600 million cash and park it in a bank account. Doesn't make any sense. And Peter Thiel was the one who divested out of Silicon Valley and started its downfall, which led to it collapsing. And he like publicly announced it. He was like, "I'm doing this. Like everyone else should do it too." And then like the domino effect brought it down. So I don't know about Peter Thiel. I'm much more confident that Elon Musk has turned on the people who were backing him. But yeah, I mean, he certainly has a background that would suggest that he's bad. But I would also argue from a game theory standpoint that would, from a Sun Tzu standpoint, that would make him the most ideal target to turn against his masters. And Sun Tzu talks about how that's the best spy you can have is the spy where you turn the trusted confidant of the enemy against the enemy.
Yeah, I was reading. I'm just preparing the last chapter of a book on the occult Tesla series, and I've just been doing a bit of a dive on Thiel and Musk and I just sort of see them. Like I was just reading Peter Thiel's The Straussian Moment essay from 2007, and looking into his whole operation with In-Q-Tel, the CIA, and all of these Straussian neocons from Irving Kristol to the whole Wolfowitz crowd was always like behind the growth of Palantir. You had the same In-Q-Tel operations guiding Elon into Russia to set up SpaceX back in 22 as well, and the whole transhuman. I don't know. Like I just think that it's. I don't. Then the Knights of Malta. That's another thing too that gets me. Is not just the transhumanism thing, but it's the role of the fact that Thiel is a member of the Knights of Malta. He's on the Bilderberger steering committee, which is the highest you can get, and his patronage. Like when I was reading this thing, it became clear all of the influences that he attributes to having shaped his identity are what I've identified as like the worst agents of pure evil throughout history, from Hobbes to Locke to the Straussians, to the behaviorists, Richard Thaler, who's sponsoring him as well in 2008 and 9. It's just there's all this weird shit that's tied to the military-industrial complex and these Gnostic secret societies that I don't. Yeah. It gives me the heebie-jeebies.
And it probably should. I mean, it probably should. Yeah. I'm not. And remember what I said earlier. It's like we should restrain ourselves from going too deep into like the white hat, black hat game and being like, he's a good guy, he's a bad guy, because they're human, right? They're human. And so Peter Thiel could be a bad guy, and his orbit, him existing in the orbit of Donald Trump, Elon Musk, doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, look at Miriam Adelson. She funded $100 million into Trump's campaign, right? And she's like one of Netanyahu's closest confidants. She's like, her and Netanyahu and her late husband are all we're all super tight. She also funded Trump's first campaign. But look at the way Trump treated Netanyahu. Look at the things that Trump has done to Netanyahu, where I don't think Netanyahu likes Trump at all. I think they understand.
I do think Trump really does want to have stability for business opportunities and cooperation. I think that's overall what's animating him, for sure.
Yeah. But I think that's something. Huh? But I think his greatest strength, I mean, operating in an information battle space, which is what this is, a 5th generation warfare information battle space, as General Flynn describes it, is the fact that he's such an enigma in the eyes of like the objective observer, is that Donald Trump is such an enigma. He looks like a Zionist. He acts like a Zionist. He talks like a Zionist. Yet there are plenty of things that I can point to that would totally contradict the idea of him being a Zionist. And that is a very advantageous position to be in, because if your enemy doesn't know what you are, especially in the era of identity politics, how can they possibly organize a defense against you? Because they don't know what path you're going to take, and they're used to operating in these little neatly defined boxes of like identity politics. So he says this, he acts like this, he must be this, therefore he's going to do this. Well, if that's your mode of thinking and that's the way you're operating, then it's very, very easy to game plan around you, because you're operating from a known playbook. Versus if you're the guy that nobody knows what you're going to do next, that gives, that's the fog of war, and that gives you all the advantage on the battlefield.
No, that's true. I guess for me, I get very nervous around the Order of Malta, the Knights Hospitaller, which have such deep penetrations in a weird synergistic relationship with the Jesuits, as far as they've penetrated through Opus Dei and other things. A lot of the alt-right organizations, and have been patronizing the growth of various subsects of organizations, Rosicrucian orders set up by Crowley and L. Ron Hubbard, his disciple. They even like infiltrated the military around the Temple of Set, which interfaces with the Scientology crowds quite a bit. And there's just been this ongoing thing that seems to get protection and support by a certain inner core of these esoteric Maltese operatives. And they're just everywhere. When I look at this history, I just see everything bad happening as far as those who murdered JFK, covered it up, did all of these things. They're all affiliated with these Gnostic, satanic core orders that were overseeing the Crusades, that saw the growth of the Straussians inside of the Republican Party, that pushed the Heritage Foundation via Britain. And I guess I have like cautious optimism that Trump is able to, because they were also there, like the Knights of Malta were operational in the American Revolution, and Benjamin Franklin was able to organize at least a certain layer of those knights to be useful for the idea of the American Revolution. But they weren't able to get their way. They had a very different idea of what that new age was supposed to look like, that they were helping to bring about, as far as a new type of radically neo-crusader order in a Calvinist veneer of predeterminism. Like, they had a very different idea of what they wanted to come out of that. And there was like a bit of a risk on both parts of the so-called good and bad side, of Ben Franklin and those who he was working or using, and they thought they were using him. And maybe it was a bit of both, because we saw that in the wake of it, there were these Trojan horses left behind inside of the American deep state that were able to then build themselves up and sabotage the good at various times, which had a lot to do with the fact that the American Revolution's ideals weren't consolidated when we had a greater opportunity to do that 250 years ago. The allowance of certain things like these hereditary orders that set up the Skull and Bones, out of Yale, or the Russell Clan, or the Society of Cincinnati, that was a good idea in some way, but it was based on a hereditary idea of the kids and grandkids forever of the leaders of the American Revolution, which became a basis of elitism, corruption. We saw what John Quincy Adams' grandkids did as far as ushering in more Hellfire Club type operations into America at the end of the 19th century and undoing what Lincoln was doing. So there's always this battle of these subtle occult forces that want to take the good and use it and pervert it and turn it inside out. Definitely, yeah. I think that for my part, when it comes to discussions of Bitcoin or what we know or don't know about what is running Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, I take the approach that there's, that there is natural law, that it demands that we overcome limits to growth by making discoveries. And whether they are dishonest or honest, I think that they represent a faction of the oligarchy that realizes that it's not in their, at the very least, this is my approach, okay? I'm not saying that this is the way it is. I'm just saying this is how I'm thinking about it, is that at the very least, they seem to represent a faction of the oligarchy that realizes that it's not in their self-interest to go with the current 1992 plan of the New World Order that will necessarily demand a nuclear war with Russia and or China and Iran and North Korea. That's not good. And we have to, at the very least, unshackle the constraints on creativity, technological growth that have been withheld for the last decades. And we have to start allowing that to start, we have to allow that into the civilian sector again in order just to be relevant and compete on an economic basis with maybe an intention of subversion, years down the line. And maybe a faction wants to think, okay, we can gamble it now and then subvert the good and create a new global UFO cult mystery religion in the future and game it now. But anyway, that's the pragmatic way I'm thinking about it, at the very least.
Yeah. So this is a good question right here that Shelley asks. What is this existential war actually about? And I would argue, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to posit it, but the way that I would posit it, ultimately, when you strip away all of the veneers, you strip away all the identity politics and all of the tribalism and all of the contrived paradigms that have been foisted upon everyone, the layers and layers and layers of paradigm. I think it comes down to this. An empire's ability, a government's ability, a secular authority's ability to extract energy from the individual. I think that's what it all comes down to. When I say energy, I'm talking about your wealth. Because if you think of energy in terms of you go out and you work 40 hours a week and you're compensated X number of dollars for that energy expense, that those dollars then represent an exertion of your energy. So their ability to extract wealth out of you, extract your energy, your life source out of you, out of the individual. I think that's what this whole thing's about. And once you cut that off, and it's also done through usury, it's done through taxation, it's done through regulation, it's done through all these different ways, poisoning you, controlling your economy, all these different things, indoctrination, information suppression, by removing that in every aspect of life, by decentralizing knowledge, decentralizing wealth, decentralizing power, decentralizing everything. That's ultimately how you dismantle empire, because empire is completely dependent on the idea of centralized control. So anything that moves us towards that goal, that end game, I think is what the fight's about ultimately. And, we can sit here and talk for 5 hours about those different dynamics, but as far as Donald Trump goes and what he's doing, I personally look at politics as a soap opera. It's been a soap opera for the past 2 centuries, a century, whatever, ever since the creation of media, which newspapers existed in the American Revolution, and said some of the most horrifying things you could imagine about George Washington. And they called him a traitor, and they said he should be hanged and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think what Donald Trump has done, Donald Trump, who, by the way, has a long history in the World Wrestling Federation. He's in the Hall of Fame. He's lifelong friends with the McMahons. He just appointed Linda McMahon, who was the president of the World Wrestling Entertainment Incorporation for decades, and made Donald Trump an actual character on her show, and spoke at the RNC and said that Donald Trump was the highest ratings they ever got was when Trump was on screen. He just appointed her to be the secretary of education yesterday, and basically said, I'm tasking her with basically destroying the Department of Education. That's her job. So I think what he's done is he's taken the soap opera that's operated for so long, it's all theater, and he's turned it into a wrestling soap opera. and he's made all these characters. He's cast them all, you know, lying Ted Cruz, Crooked Hillary, Sleepy Joe. Like, he's given them all stage names. He's now appointing people to his cabinet who are complete television characters. Every single person he's appointed. You know, the first time around, he was appointing people that nobody'd ever heard of. Christopher Miller as Secretary of Defense after he lost the 2020 election, after it was stolen from him. He appointed, you know, people that nobody had ever heard of. Mark Esper. Like, these are names that nobody knows. Now he's appointing people names that my mom is texting me being like, oh my gosh, Pete Hegseth. And I'm like, who is Pete Hegseth? It's like, oh, it's like some guy from Fox News. He appointed a guy from Fox News to be Secretary of Defense. It's like, we are literally watching a World Wrestling Federation pay-per-view event, and Trump is basically, he's become the executive producer, and he's moving people around, and he's making it a television production. And I think it's going to culminate in something very, very entertaining. But I think the next 3 months, we're going to see the entertainment value, maybe even like the fear value, because there's going to be some fear, I think, with like nuclear scare events, just reach like critical mass. So I'm very encouraged by what I see, not because the individuals that he's appointing are all necessarily would be like my top choice, but because I see a greater pattern emerging, which has to do with breaking these systems of control that you have described, the Knights of Malta, everything that they have spent centuries setting up being torn down. And that's going to take jarring people out of what they're comfortable with. So,
sure. I'm just noticing it's 2:07. Do we want to do you want to run through any questions from the audience or anything? Or are we good to just wrap up?
Let's just hit the rant. We got one rant.
Okay. All right.
D-Dale, $5. Great show. Appreciate it, D-Dale. Yeah, we'll just kind of leave there. Is there another ad to do?
Oh, no, that was it. We're good.
Okay, right. Well, with that said, we will sign off. I think next week, I talked to Colonel Towner Walk, and she was at GART, about coming on and doing Syria, like doing a deep dive into Syria, talking about, because I do think that all the players are now present in Syria. And
let's do it.
It looks like the fight's going to be there. She can talk to us about the proxies that are operating there, the Operation Gladio stuff. So maybe we'll try to do that next week.
I love it. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we'll see y'all next week.
All right. See y'all.